I've been focusing very much on, bridging between private and public. And once I read this article in Financial Times, and there was a sociologist or anthropologist who talked about the cost of friction.
Right.
Reducing the cost of friction. How much energy we lose or effectiveness we lose by having conflicts. So I've always been obsessed with this, working between the public and the private. So I've been a regulator, and then I worked for industry, and for a while when I worked on vaccines, I was actually a payer, as we call it. As I've always been, trying to bridge the relationship between the private innovation sector and the public that actually pay for the innovation.
What are some of the biggest challenges you've had to face in building those bridges?
And I actually gave a lecture in Uppsala on, I called it Tribes and Religion. Mm. And that many people are obsessed with, various beliefs that blocks progress. And that, particularly in that speech, I made 2 points. One was on this sort of north-south thing, we call it, okay? So this is the global dimension with a narrative that you got, the rich north and the poor south, And that narrative doesn't really help. The other gap is between, people that work with pharmaceuticals and medtech regulations and those that work in public health. And it's very different attitudes towards, evidence and working with the private sector. So, many people that work, again, take the regulators, they know that who develops medicines is the pharma industry, okay? And the medtech industry, and you have to work with them. You may not love them, but you have to respect them and work with them. So I think there are these dimensions of tensions, I should call it. I shouldn't say conflicts, but tensions. So I remain, committed to bridging between the public and the private.
I mean, that's a very big challenge and also a very, very important thing to succeed in.
It's not always easy, because I run into these people both in my sectors. I've spent most of my years in big pharma, and I still run into people that basically hate the officials and the politicians and the regulators and say they're all idiots. They're not, they're all clever people.
Yeah.
And it goes both ways, because you have also many public officials that think that pharma is all bad and they're all corrupt and all lying, cheating, It's not true, So I spent most of my years, actually, I was in drug development, working for, I was in Switzerland, actually, for Roche and Novartis and working in drug development. And these people have so much integrity. No one's cheating, So I think, and you can hear in my voice that I'm disturbed by the lack of trust often.
Yeah. But the lack of trust is a very serious issue. And I get the sense that you also have a strong personal ambition for science and innovation in Europe, but also globally.
Yes. I think it's very interesting that you see two big sectors somehow converging or having to converge, So you have big tech, including AI. And then you got the incumbents, I call us, okay? So pharma and medtech. And they're coming together because the tech solutions we need now is about marrying or combining, typical medicines, molecular biology, with AI and data science. And that this is a challenge because you've got two different cultures. If you allow me to expand on this, okay?
Yes,
so I think,
go ahead.
So pharma, medtech, we have a tradition of having a sort of prospective process. We generate a hypothesis, and then we look for evidence. So we do prospective clinical trials. Okay, it takes time, it's a lot of money. That many of the people in the tech industry, they have a different attitude. And I say this sometimes, maybe I'm exaggerating, but research for a tech company is having a focus group of consumers. When I hear tech innovators saying that you have to throw things 100 things to the wall and see what sticks. In pharma, we don't do that. Never. You will not expose citizens, patients to that. Okay, we always test everything beforehand. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these two. And someone talked about this even as tectonic plates. That they're two huge industries that somehow have to find each other. And it's going to be very interesting to see how that pans out. But I hope that the sort of evidence-based medicine philosophy will prevail. So I think pharma, big pharma, old pharma, call it that, they has a lot to teach tech.
In this kind of changing environments, when the industry changed this much, how do you think also governments can come in and complement, help out with the health innovation?
I've always held the view that I think that both regulators, okay, so let's make the distinction. You have regulators that sort of approve the medicines. Many people may not know this, that this is a very dynamic process. It's not like, the regulator sits there and waits for an application from a company after 10 years of development of a product. No, they're involved throughout. We have something called scientific advice. And now we will even develop something in Europe that we called, sort of new concepts for sandboxing, we call it. Meaning that the regulators will sit down with companies and maybe many companies, even competitors, and companies across the spectrum. So if you have, for instance, new Alzheimer drugs, they require not only that there's a medicine, but also that you have diagnostics in place, and you have the whole path, we call it clinical pathway for the patients. So regulators are not passive. Payers, there's another group of people, okay, which are actually deciding on whether you pay for things. They have not historically been so much actively involved, so they sort of come in late. And I keep saying that payers should not be payers, they should be buyers, meaning that they need to get organized. And this is something that's being discussed a lot now in Europe. And as you know, even if Norway is not a member of the European Union, which you should be, you are part of the system, okay? Yes. So Norway is very active. And actually, I must say, thought leader on many things, So the Norwegian government is actually pretty good in being a good payer. But we need to move to more of joint, we call it procurement or buying, where those people that pay organize themselves similarly to we have the regulators. Okay? So we have the European Medicines Agency, okay? And Norway is part of that. But on the payer side, we need to have the same, with some grouping that would come in early and say, okay, we like the innovation, we're willing to pay for it, but not at any cost. Okay, so I think that's what's required now.
In Europe, it has been with the Horizon 2030. They went with defined missions for these problems.
Yeah, the cancer mission, and now there's going to be a focus now on cardiovascular health and so on.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how do you see that kind of approach?
Yeah. So first of all, I think the Horizon programs, okay, which is the EU R&D programs, they're largely good. Okay. I mean, this is the case. So I lived in Brussels for many years, and I still go there almost every week. Yeah. And I see, there are programs that are okay, not very good. And then there are those that are fantastic. But it goes with the territory. You know, if you're in research and development, and you know that from your own career, I think, you know, sometimes, you know, you have a breakthrough and sometimes not, okay? So you shouldn't be too picky. You have to invest broadly. So I think the EU programs are extremely helpful. And particularly now, again to come back to the US situation, which is preoccupying my mind a lot now. If the US is scaling down on publicly funded R&D, Europe has to step up and show the way that you have this public-private interplay, you know, that is the public side that says what's important or not, and then you work with the private sector because that's where the innovation is.
How do you see the role of universities in that intersection between the public and the private?
Extremely important. And I had the pleasure, actually, last time I was here in Norway, in Oslo, it was probably a month ago, I had the pleasure of meeting this newly founded alliance between the Nordic university hospitals. And they have these people so this was like the CEOs, so a very small group of people. But they have this understanding that they have to work with the private sector. So there's no ideology there. And of course, has always been a challenge to combine in university hospitals, delivering healthcare, which is a daily operation, with doing research. And I think many people don't recognize that actually it's a double. So I take Stockholm then as an example. You know, we have a Karolinska Institute, which is the medical university, and then we have the Karolinska Hospital. And they have different bosses.
Yeah.
So the institute is a university that reports directly to the government. And then you have the hospital that works actually for a region. So I think in Norway you have these Helseplattformen.
Yeah,
right.
That's correct.
So to combine these missions it's really a challenge. Now they play an extremely important role because that's where the talents are there, and that's where we and I say we in the pharma industry and medtech, you know, we would do the trials and research.
Mm. Yes, and then all the stakeholders have to come together eventually, right? And that's also where we run into the trust issues like you talked about in the beginning.
Yeah.
If you come back to that a little bit, why do you think trust is so challenging across sectors? Sharing
your data, your health data, is key. And we had this learning from the UK, where was it Tony Blair or Cameron? No, it was probably Tony Blair, who said that, you know, the health service in the UK is called the NHS. And he said every NHS patient is a research person. And that didn't go down well, that statement.
It didn't?
No. It was Daily Mail, all these tabloids were saying that, you know, that you'll steal the data and da-da-da. So you have to be very, very, you know, we have to be much better in articulating to citizens why using your data. And actually, what's really interesting how we talked about Karolinska before, but, you know, so I was on this panel a few months ago with one of the deans of Karolinska, Anna Martling, and she said this, and I really liked that. She said, you know what? I demand that my data will be used.
Yeah.
I mean, I of course, you know, if I go to the hospital, if I have some condition, there will be data. I insist that my data will be used to improve health for future generations.
Yeah.
So to create a movement, and we have this conversation now in Europe about, you know, opting in and opting out, whatever. We have this new European health data space legislation. And I won't go into those details, but to create the spirit in the population that sharing your health data is critical for your children, for next generations. I think that's very important. It's all about trust.
Yeah.
And also to accept actually the private sector has a role to play. It's not only that you share data with universities and hospitals, but you allow the private sector to be part of that innovation system.
Yes. Yes, and for certain patient groups, there's been this talking about how some trials or some studies have relied too much on one group. So I'm thinking it's sort of the same to get patients to see that.
Oh, now you get me going again.
That's why we're here. But yeah.
No, but there was a, sorry, I'm a bit...
No, I'm thinking it's the same, that for patients to have that ownership and to see that their data contribute.
Yeah. So we have this term called diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, that's a really important point, right? And you've seen now also in AI, which is not I'm not an expert on AI. That AI, what have you trained the AI? You train the algorithms. What have you trained them on?
Yes.
White people.
Yeah.
And white male people.
Exactly.
And, so this question of, I would call it rather representativity. Okay? So I work for this company called IQVIA, okay? So we do lots of clinical trials, so we do all this testing. And I have a big boss who says that, when we talk about including Black people in trials, in clinical trials, we're not talking about Black people from Alabama. We're talking about Black people in Africa. So I think this whole dimension of, and it's not only clinical trials, but beyond that AI. So if we're going to apply all these digital tools, what are they trained on?
Yeah.
I think that's a big issue. And this is where the jury is out. And here you see a real, I think now, a potential difference in attitude between the United States and Europe. How to regulate AI. So I'm not so worried about regulating medicines because we have this framework, okay? But if we're going to use AI tools in our smartphones or something, to guide us and what is that developed on?
Yeah.
So I think here there's a role, and here's a role for Europe. Back to Europe, okay? So I think Europe, including Norway, of course, we are data rich. And Europe and the European Commission, the European Union, has the ambition to, and this is interesting, on the one hand, to liberate data, to make the data available, but then regulate it. So this is going to be really interesting. And again, this is not so much about pharma. This is more about the AI and tech industry, how they will be regulated, how you make sure that what they provide as services actually is derived from, a representative group of people.
Does it play into the ideas of European resilience and data sovereignty that you're able to use the data from your population?
So the resilience or sovereignty sort of language. I mean, there's one component which is more physical. It's about, where are the factories? Where do we make the medicines? And are we self-sufficient or are we relying? We saw that during the pandemic, how, countries had export bans and they stopped supplies and we had other problems with the Suez Canal, terrorists and whatever, So that's one component of the sort of physical sovereignty. But in terms of data sovereignty and resilience, we have a huge opportunity. I mean, Europe is extremely rich on data and going way back. So I think we have an enormous opportunity. And I read, I think it was in Financial Times today, actually, on the plane, I read an article about, that Europe can be the new superpower on data, and particularly on health data, if we get our act together. But we are 27 member states, plus Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. And of course, you have Switzerland, where I live, and the UK as well. I think I see that as a whole collective. We have enormous opportunities. And one challenge is, of course, to make the clever people stay in Europe.
Yeah.
And for them to find capital, so they don't all have to go to the US or China. So the Capital Markets Union, which is something that the Commission is working on, is extremely important also,
Yeah.
That, so we're too fragmented still.
So there have been discussions around like doing innovative work, especially on AI, how it's been difficult in Europe because of the legislations and the regulations, and also that this was missing. So it was hard to do something before you knew what the rules were going to be. But do you think, is this really, like historically looking at other parts of healthcare and also other aspects like climate and how we deal with factories, for instance, is it really that different that you have to have the regulations in place? Or this tension between regulation and innovation?
That's an excellent question, because I actually think there's no contradiction. I think regulation is what's needed.
Yeah.
I think, again, back to the US, I don't think that's the way forward. I think, it's all connected, We say in my space, we talk about One Health.
Yeah.
Where, antimicrobial resistance, animal welfare, health, public health, it's all connected, And I think Europe should take the lead. So I don't think at all that we should talk about deregulating or something. But we need to have clever regulators.
Yes.
And also regulators that accept the private sector. I wouldn't say love the private sector, but they need to accept that innovation is coming from the private sector. They need to make money. We saw this in COVID-19. I mean, these companies that came up with the vaccines, which I worked on, as you know,
yeah,
they made a lot of money, but they succeeded.
Yes,
they delivered.
Okay? Yeah, and that was a huge benefit for everyone.
Yeah, it was. It was. So I think on AI, I don't buy these arguments that Europe is over-regulating. No, I think a bigger problem is capital, venture capital, and funding for these clever people to be able to stay here and set up shop and run companies and not having to go to Boston, all of them, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is the plan. I mean, this whole data plan of the European Union, which actually preceded the pandemic, this was before. So Commissioner President Ursula von der Leyen, she launched this very much with the support of Macron from France, and then at that time with Merkel even. They launched this whole data strategy, and the whole idea was that we need to use the data sources we have in Europe and make sure that these data people, these data scientists, they don't have to leave Europe. They can stay here and start companies here.
Yes. So what we see from my line of work in working with universities and scientists who use a lot of sensitive data, we see it's become a competitive edge for the countries that are able to provide this data, healthcare data for science.
I absolutely agree with you. And I said this actually, I come to Norway frequently. I love this country. So I spoke at the Life Science conference, was it a few weeks ago? And I said exactly that. That, particularly in the context of the new European regulations that are coming, that, be ahead. And also I believe in, you made the point earlier about trust, okay? Mm. So don't think that, you should deregulate and everything should be free. No. Clever regulators is needed. They are needed, because otherwise you won't get the trust from the population. You're going to have people saying, you will have a movement saying, oh, I don't want my data to be used.
Yeah.
So building that trust only comes from strong regulations.
But we've seen also how regulations that were maybe originally intended for other types of data, like data collected from big tech companies and such, how it's also hit universities and healthcare systems. And maybe the sector wasn't really prepared to handle it, but how do you think we can use regulations, like you say, cleverly to be able to solve the big challenges?
No. And one case in point is actually the data privacy. So GDPR, we call it, okay? So in Brussels, where I used to work, and I still go there all the time, this is viewed as the best thing ever, okay?
Yeah.
No. So the company I work for now, and also many universities and others, they were complaining and saying, oh my God, what a mess, it's so much bureaucracy. But I think it was largely a success.
Yeah.
And all the politicians in Brussels, they think that this was a great success, right? And that's why now you have this challenge now on AI, what are we going to do? What's the right level of regulating it? But I think Europe could be, we could be the beacon, which is my latest favorite word, to basically show the way. Yeah. But it's about trust, as you said. The population needs to trust private sector and regulators that the data will be used in a sensible way.
Yes. We also talked a little bit about trust in tech and healthcare, which is also something I know you're very passionate about, and how to get these two, I don't know what you say, stakeholder sides to collaborate. If we can circle back to that, why do you think tech and healthcare struggle with collaboration?
So first of all, no one has made any money on digital health. Okay,
really?
So I'm old enough to remember when we had something called Yahoo. They had some health thing. Okay, then we had all these. Google tried. There is Google Health thing and Google Research app and Apple. They tried Apple Research. They're not making any money on health.
Yeah.
And I think one reason is because, there's not the evidence, and they haven't had the right approach to provide the evidence. I remember I was an early adopter, actually. Now I don't wear any cool gadgets now, but I was one of the early. I bought an Apple Watch very early, but it was intended to do all these things, and it didn't. It couldn't, because the evidence was not there. Right. So I think the whole approach to evidence generation, which is not only important for the regulators and payers that will pay for it. That's another topic, Who will pay for this? If you have an app or a software service that will help people with schizophrenia or depression or something, who's going to pay for that? If you sell a medicine through a pharmacy, there is a pathway and you get paid. But if you have an app or something in your Aura ring or something, who's going to pay for that? Okay, today is private. It's a private market. So I think there is a fundamental difference in terms of importance of evidence, and ultimately that will be required for regulators. It's going to be required for the people that pay, and at the end, trust of the population.
So there's a lot to talk about Europe in relation to the US or China, but do we forget the rest of the world?
I mentioned earlier that we talked about resilience. and sovereignty. So there is a physical component, which is about manufacturing things. And then there is another one, which is more about evidence generation. And here I think we need to pay a lot of attention to Africa, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, where we have not included enough of patients in clinical trials, and we don't have manufacturing capacity. So this is the big learning from the pandemic, particularly if people close their borders. India, which is called the pharmacy of the world, they had an export ban.
Right.
On vaccines. US had an export ban. The UK had an export ban. Okay, Europe did not.
Yeah.
So we had one vaccine dose went to Europe and one vaccine dose went internationally. We never imposed any. There's one little exception once, just to make the point. But so I think that the learning from that is that not only do we need to have clinical research and AI development globally to make sure that it's representative, but we also need to have a string of factories.
Yeah.
It all has to be regional, So made in Africa for Africa, I say. Tested in Africa, made in Africa for Africa. So I think this should be the big plan now, to make sure that we have capabilities, particularly on pandemics, that we have capabilities worldwide and not only in the three countries we talked about. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe that's too detailed, but one thing that I think personally is very fascinating is then how we train the next generation of scientists into also thinking globally, and the importance of open source, like the open science, the open software, the whole open science movement.
Back to the whole public-private dimension, okay? This is another version of the same, is that on the one hand, you want to have open science, but at the same time, you have to recognize the innovation system and the fact that, the public sector may pay a lot for research and innovation, like through the Horizon programs. But eventually, the big money to develop something, whether it's a pharmaceutical or medtech, or it's coming from the private sector. So how do you combine? And it's then I have to raise the question of IP, it's intellectual property.
Yes.
So how do you combine the spirit of open science with the fact that there are innovators that need to go and raise money from venture capitalists and others, and they want to know that we can actually make some money on this. So I think, but I think I don't think we have a huge problem with that. I think particularly in Europe, I think we have a good balance between open science and particularly now with the European health data space, which is this new legislation, which I'm talking about tomorrow at the meeting here.
Yeah.
I think, we have the right balance between liberating data while regulating it and accepting that people can make money on it.
Yeah. Looking on the road ahead for the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, what direction do you think Europe should go in?
To, retain the trust, which I think we have kind of from the population in working on with health data, whether it's for developing medicines or whether for developing AI algorithms. I think we need to have strong regulation.
To have those regulations, you really need people with a lot of backbone, or who are able to stand in the chaos and the storms.
But we have, I tell you what. So I've lived in Brussels for many years, and I've worked in European policy environment for a very long time. Okay, there's some very clever people around.
Yeah.
And I think occasionally they make some stupid things. Okay. But I think largely I have a lot of faith.
So you're here for a seminar about the European health data space. What are some of the additional challenges for that to become a success more than public trust?
So now in this legislation, there are all sorts of modalities, for member states to have opt-in and opt-outs and everything. But we mustn't forget that the data holders, so such as the academics, I mean, they love their data, and they don't want to give it away. It's like a friend of mine, Professor Bengt Jönsson from Stockholm. He says, data is like your children. You love your own data, but you don't want anyone else to play with them. So I think there's that issue as well. So let's not be ignorant of the fact that we need to have all these, particularly here in the Nordics, where we're data rich, and we have all these quality registries and patient registries, And some of these academics they made a career of keeping the data to themselves. So again, it's about finding that right balance, that sharing the data while respecting. So the data should not be for free. Yeah. And I'm very glad, by the way, in this European health data space that the Commission and the Parliament and the lawmakers at the end really recognized that data is not entirely for free. So if you've spent all this money curating and building registries, and you may have, you may have dozens of people, PhD students, others that are sort of working on this, you're funding it by having this data. Pharma is willing to pay. IQVIA, where I work, we're willing to pay. So let's not take that away. This altruism. So sharing data, fine, but let's not be naive about altruism, because there's a whole ecosystem of funding, these various systems.
Mm. So for the young scientists, policymakers, entrepreneurs who are watching this, what is your message to them going forward?
I gave a lecture to all the pharmacy student graduates. They have all taken their diplomas, and they were there with their families, and they were all very happy. So I said, if you think you're done now, this is just the beginning. Stay curious. Stay curious. And then I say, mix and match on education. I think it's extremely important that if you're in science, you should study things like, theory of knowledge, they call it. And conversely, people that do arts and philosophy and that stuff, should learn a bit from natural sciences about evidence making and, the rigor of scientific testing. So this is what I say. And maybe you throw in a few languages in as well.
Yes, that is excellent advice. Thank you so much.
Sure, it was a pleasure.
Really great conversation.